Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Protagoras and Democritus. So Protagoras, these two individuals, supposedly Protagoras was actually the teacher of Democritus. However, based on the dates that I found for these two individuals, it dates Protagoras as to have been born earlier than Democritus in 490 BC, whereas Democritus we have the date of 560 BC. But nonetheless, Democritus was supposedly a teacher of Protagoras, so just keep that in mind. Maybe the dates are wrong, or maybe the teacher was younger than the student. I just think it's a strange dynamic, so take these dates with a grain of salt. But once again, this is so far in the past anyways. I'd be impressed if you have all these dates well ordered out in your head. So either way, he said by Plato that he was the first professional sophist. So we'll see how that sort of ties into his character and sort of into his beliefs. But he's most famous for this quote, and I'll explain it more later, but it's just so you can start thinking about the concept. Man is the measure of all things. Of all things that are, they are. Of all things that are not, they are not. So basically what this is going to mean, or it does mean, and I will explain later, is that man's perception is the only truth in the world, rather than being objective truths. Man's perspective, man's measure is the truth to everything. So we'll get to that more later. So he was born in Abdera, which is in modern day Thrace, Thrace is in modern day Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece. But either way, he was born in Thrace, the same place actually where Spartacus was supposedly from, and many of the other gladiators, but that's many years in the future. But nonetheless, just to give a little bit more of the history of Thrace. Also, as we will see later, Democritus was also from Thrace. But he eventually ends up moving to Athens, because Athens was sort of the forefront of thought at the time, and for many years in the past and for many years in the future, as we will soon see in the Socrates sort of line of or lineage. So it's supposedly he was a student of Democritus. So, and this is kind of strange because Democritus was was really into the mathematics and really more of a scientist, whereas Protagoras, as we can see here in the quote, mathematics is unknowable and the terminology distasteful. So he had no interest in mathematics despite his teacher being that way. But nonetheless, he was sort of brought up by Democritus, and he was also supposedly knew Anaxagoras, who I covered in a previous video. Also, it's said that he was had a good relationship with Heraclitus. It said that Anaxagoras was actually Heraclitus' teacher, but Protagoras, who was probably younger, had a good relationship with Heraclitus. There's this quote, or this talk about a discussion that went on between Heraclitus, who's actually featured in Plutarch's Lives and in the previous series that I also covered. But there's a discussion between Protagoras and Democritus that goes as follows. In an athletic contest, a man had accidentally hit and killed with a javelin another. So was the death to be attributed to the javelin, the man who threw it, or the authorities responsible for the conduct of the games? So this was a discussion or a dialogue that went on between Heraclitus and Protagoras, but basically it's about causation and who really is the cause. In my personal opinion, I think, the vast majority of the cause would probably be the one who threw it, but not entirely, and I don't think it would be a binary thing. It's not all his fault, it's not all the javelin's fault, it's not all the events' fault. It's probably a certain percentage in each, and that's, I think, what he found to be the case too, and as Heraclitus also agreed with. As mentioned previously, although he was a student of Democritus, he had no real interest in mathematics. Another quote on this is, "For perceptible lines are not the kind of things the geometer talks about, since no perceptible thing is straight or curved in that way, nor a circle tangent to a ruler at a point." So what he kind of means by this, and sort of alluding to his main thesis, is that the study of mathematics doesn't maybe even apply to real world. So for example, the straight lines that he talks about. There were not actually a lot of straight times back in the day, because to cut stone or any object perfectly straight was very difficult. And in the natural world, like, they didn't see no trees, no planes or anything was actually truly flat, and perfect geometrical shapes were impossible to find. So he thought it was sort of more of an art than a science, and to that he thought it was more of an art. And he says art without practice and practice without art are nothing. So he saw math as interesting, but obviously he kind of thought it was like a dead end sort of path to keep looking at. Very much different from Democritus in that manner. And that quote was specifically by Aristotle, and he said it, but Aristotle said that. So once again, not a lot of writings exist. Actually, no full writings exist from Protagoras, only little small pieces, and mostly references from others. Once again, most of these people, this is over 1,000, almost 1,500, or over 1,500 years ago. So it's not a lot is still known about this individual, but his influence can probably be seen in terms of ripples, in terms of influence on all other philosophers, namely in this guy's case the sophists who followed him. Many of their ideas are the result of his, and also he had heavy influence on Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, as true for pretty much all of these pre-Socratic philosophers. So he believed in, and he was one of the first to advocate for virtue training. So at this time, this was before they had a really well-established schooling system. So there was obviously like the Eleatic school and the Milesian school and certain schools, but they didn't really know, and still to this day, I don't think people really know. They thought one of the most important topics to research is how to teach generally. So rather than most individuals at the time who thought about training in specific topics for learning, for example, training in rhetoric or training in public speaking, he thought about more broad topics. So, for example, he thought the main topics would be management of one's own affairs, management of one's household, how to best run your house, and manage your public affairs and how to best contribute through words and action. So broader topics rather than specific topics. Which is right and which is wrong, I think, personally, it probably depends on the learner. Some people learn better by becoming an expert of one thing, and they sort of, like, for example, some individuals might learn best by getting really, really good at, like, piano, for example, and the process of learning that will help them be a better learner in general. So if you master the piano, if you become a level 10 in the Royal Conservatory of Piano, your ability to pick up another topic like chemistry would be quicker because you've learned that concept of mathematics. But Protagoras believed in a different concept where holistic, one must learn holistically the whole time. So study all the languages and they'll all sort of get synergies. Both are probably true, and it probably depends more on the learner. But I think it's important that people like Protagoras were actually thinking about this. And nowadays, a lot of people have problems with the modern educational system, but not a lot of people are presenting solutions or viable solutions that have any chance of being implemented. So it's also said that he was very interested in like linguistics, or what's called orthoepia, and which is Aristotle says that he spent a lot of time contributing to the language by giving classifications to grammatical genders. So we don't really have that in modern day English, genderism in terms of our speech, but in most Latin-based languages they have gender. So he was also a linguist, and I cannot personally tell you his speak to his influence on this because firstly not a lot is known, and secondly I'm not familiar with the language of his time. But nonetheless, I think it's important to note in terms of, once again, the holistic nature of him. He was not only a great philosopher, but he was also a great linguist as well. And he also trained in the Olympics for a time. They no longer have it anymore. There was actually a debate competition, and he was one of the first to contribute to that, and he even wrote a book supposedly on how to win debates, and so he saw that also as a form of art. And nowadays I think it's perceived as disrespectful, or it's people don't like the concept of debate, but I think debate is very important, and I think debate is really what will advance society going forward. So obviously for such a long time ago, having such forethought, and something that we sort of moved away from in today's society. And Diogenes Laertius, who is sort of like the Plutarch of leaders of thought, or the Plutarch of philosophers, he says that he had a taxonomy of speech, so he built up a process of how one might speak, which is assertion, question, answer, and command. So basically he thought there's a formula to speech and an art to speech, and each word should be have a precise meaning, and it had important implications on interpreting the law and other such forms. In terms of techniques of Aristides, so once again, he wrote this book called Techniques of Wranglings, which is like techniques of wrestling, but it's once again a book about rhetoric and arguing, and he was one of the first to incorporate this into the Olympic Games. I think that would be pretty interesting today if there was, maybe it doesn't have to be in the Olympics, but if there was like a more popular debating stage. I guess nowadays it would be politics, but I guess that's a little bit high stakes, and I suppose when, like for example, the debates between top politicians, a lot of the time they probably have to conceal their intended meaning more to abide by the party lines, whereas I think YouTube is starting to get that, where there's long form dialogues, particularly individuals like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson. They have these long discussions and debates where they really express their true opinions, and there's a lot to learn from it, whereas but otherwise there isn't too much of that to be seen, whereas the modern political debate stage is a little bit clouded. So it'd be cool if we had something like the Olympics again in debate. I think that would be good. So his main idea, and sorry it took so long to get there, is relativism. So once again, to go back to this quote, and sorry to repeat it, man is the measure of all things that are, they are, of all things that are not, they are not. So at the time, many of previous philosophers were looking for like an objective facts or meaning of the world. For example, Parmenides and Heraclitus believed in being and becoming, respectively, or many of the monoists, such as Anaximander, Thales, and Anaximenes, believed in water or one source of the universe, whereas Protagoras believed that all of this is sort of up in the air, and it all comes down to the perception of an individual. For example, if one were to touch like a rock, and one feels it hot and one feels the rock to be cold, or one finds the weather to be hot and one finds the weather to be cold, it says that both are right and it's somewhere in between, and it's all a matter of perception. So one individual who really did not like this is Plato. Plato really spoke out against this. Aristotle had a better appreciation of it, but Plato asks or poses the question poses the issue in that an individual might have an ill body or an ill mind, and therefore cannot perceive properly. So like if you might be have some kind of mental problem, you might actually be wrong. So man being the measure of all things cannot be true if man can be wrong. If man can be wrong, therefore there is an objective truth. So Plato sort of breaks that down, but I think it's, since a lot of Protagoras' writing still doesn't exist, some say it might have only applied to like physical objects or rather than ideas. So if Protagoras was still here to defend himself, he probably could do so better, but Plato certainly did not like the idea and found a reason to shut it down. In terms of, and lastly, so once again, similar to Anaxagoras and even Pericles, he got into a lot of troubles in Athens because he was sort of agnostic, religiously agnostic. He has this quote, concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, nor of what sort they may be, because of the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life. So kind of like Xenophanes, who also was very started speaking out against their pantheon of gods. He was sort of not as much of a scientist as Democritus, but he didn't see any reason why he might want to believe in this pantheon of gods. So once again, they believed in, Zeus and Ares and Athena and all these pantheon of gods, and he saw no proof for this, so he found it hard to believe it. Some people consider maybe he was an atheist, but he doesn't denounce the gods. He just doesn't have enough to believe in it. But or at least in terms of their structure of religion, there's no telling whether or not he believed in something, but he definitely did not subscribe to the normal conventions of their religion, and for that reason he got in a lot of trouble and maybe was expelled out of Athens. Some say, and Cicero and Diogenes note, that after kicking him out, they supposedly burned all of his books in the marketplace, so he did not get a lot of appreciation in Athens. But nonetheless, I'll get more to Protagoras in the comparison, and I think that's everything. Then we'll move on to Democritus. So Democritus, when I was young, I always, the first time I heard of Democritus, I thought he was the founder of democracy, which is not at all true. His name just happens to mean chosen by the people, but democracy is, I don't think it would make sense to attribute democracy even to one person, because democracy is just a sort of a concept of the majority. So it's kind of always been a thing. I think it's always been a thing in tribalism, even in the nucleic family, like a family of 5, for example. The 2 parents could be seen as the oligarchs, and 3 or 4 children could be seen as the plebeians, and there's it's a struggle between the 2, perhaps, if there's a democratic consensus, if the 3 or the 4 can overthrow the oligarchs. I think it's sort of an inevitable thing. What I'm saying is I don't think there was one individual person. But secondly, it's definitely not Democritus, because this is way later. Even though he did like the democratic ideals in Athens, he wasn't even from Athens, and he's way later. So nothing really to do with Democritus. But we'll get into his actual political ideas, which happen to be democratic, ironically. He's called the laughing philosopher. So as you saw, Heraclitus was considered the weeping philosopher. So they're kind of seen as 2 archetypes of styles of philosophy. One can approach everything from a sort of critical and cynical view, whereas Democritus could do everything lighthearted. But it's also said that he could have been kind of brushed people the wrong way, because he was sort of laughed at people's poor ideas. But so he was also born in Abdera, Thrace, which is like an Ionian city, once again in Bulgaria, Greece, or Turkish area. Some say he might actually be from the Milesia, maybe because his ideas might be similar to Milesian thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. Who knows, but I think the consensus is that he was born in Abdera, Thrace, and that would also make sense that him and Protagoras had a good relationship. Once again, looking at the dates, it seems strange that he was born after Protagoras, when Protagoras was supposedly his student. But nonetheless, their ideas are quite different, and there's not too much intermingling of their ideas, except for that Protagoras sort of denounced Democritus's appreciation for mathematics. It's considered that he's more of a scientist than a philosopher, and he is considered one of the founders of atomic theory. Originally, Leucippus, who I covered earlier, is considered the founder of atomic theory, but it's hard to really attribute how much of it came from either of them. Definitely the idea came from the 2 of them, but who contributed more or less, it's hard to say, but more is attributed to Democritus. He's slightly after, and there's just more writing associated with him. So he was born from a very, very wealthy family. It said they were so wealthy that when King Xerxes was traveling through his town, he stayed at their house. So this is like one of the most powerful and wealthiest kings of all time living at your house. So it must have been a very, very nice house. But nonetheless, he didn't really make any money in his life. He spent all of his money traveling, and he had a certain thirst for knowledge. So he sort of burned away all of his inheritance. Or was he burning it, or was he not? Because I don't know his father's name. No one knows his father's name, but people know his name. So perhaps he actually did the right thing. So in terms of aging him, he said he was a young man, while Anaxagoras was of old age. So that kind of gives him the 560 BC date. Some say he lived 7 years. Some people say he lived 104 years. Some people say he lived 109 years. It's hard to say, but essentially he lived a long time for that time. He was, it said on his travels he went to travel all through India. Said he got as far as India. He got to, or travel all through Asia, sorry. He got as far as India, to Ethiopia, in Africa. He went to Egypt, where I think he got his interest in mathematics, as we will soon see. Egypt was sort of the leader of mathematics at the time, and a lot of Pythagoras' beliefs and ideas came from Egypt. And not surprisingly, I think it was sort of necessary, or maybe, I don't know which they're probably correlated, but neither caused the other. But a lot of the geometric feats that they achieved in Egypt so long ago probably had either facilitated or utilized their development of mathematics far beyond even Greece. So at this time, Egypt was sort of the forefront leader in mathematics, even post Pythagoras. But Democritus was fortunate enough to be wealthy enough to travel down there and learn a lot of this. He said, and he's kind of cocky in this sense, among contemporaries, none had made greater journeys, seen more countries, and met more scholars than himself. So his kind of objective, or his or what he believed he achieved, he believed he was the most learned individual in the world because he had traveled the most, which is it is a concrete example if you do, but yeah, it's also said that he even went to Babylon, but he went all over the world, and thus he kind of gives more weight to his beliefs. Yeah, so eventually he returns from his travels in Greece when he's a little bit older, and he becomes a student of Leucippus. So Leucippus is the one who, I had a previous video on him. It's shorter because not too much is known about him, but he's considered the founder of atomic theory, so he sort of gave him a lot of ideas. But he was also a student of Anaxagoras, similar to Democritus, or Protagoras. He lived a sort of modest life, but he was still fond of partying. He thought there was no shame in having feasts and celebrating lives, but he lived exclusively for his studies. So but what's meant by that is he did not take up any real other occupation. He sort of just burned through all of his finances. But he was always cheerful, as mentioned. That's why he's called the laughing philosopher, even at the expense of laughing at other individuals. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. So yeah, so similar to Leucippus, he followed the Milesians in that he believed the Milesians were materialists. So as Thales believed in water was the source of everything. Anaximander believed infinity, which is not really a material substance, but either way, he's considered a monoist. And Anaximenes believed air, or vapor, is the center of everything. But either way, he believed there was a material concept to everything, and they sort of came up, and they believed that there was no purpose, so no underlying prime mover or final cause, as that Aristotle and Plato believed in. And he came up with this concept of the atom, along with Leucippus. So what he perceived was that some things would decay, like you saw, like a log would slowly decay. Even rocks, as getting brushed on by water, would slowly decay. And he saw that everything is sort of divisible into these invisible things, but also things can be created, like pure substance, like iron and water and such. But he believed that everything is made of these invisible, tiny little substances, and the bigger the indivisible substance, the heavier it is. So very much like the periodic table of elements as we have today, except we do now believe that they are divisible. But after we split the atom pretty recently in terms of history, but he believed that everything came from these atoms that are extremely small. And this is very, very profound thought. I think obviously now that we have certain educational backgrounds and such, we can fathom it. But imagine just sitting there and looking at an object and saying there is many smaller components it's made of. So very, very profound thought. But his ideas, obviously, so there's the atoms, and everything in between it is space, which again is true as well. But he believed in terms of their shape, they kind of were had human-like traits, so they would fit together. So he believed the iron atoms were very rigid and had hooks, so they held together very tight, whereas water atoms were like slippery and air atoms were like pervading of other atoms and very light. So each atom, or each object, kind of, their atoms sort of reflect their overall character, which is, at least in terms of our perspective of elements, somewhat true, or I would say largely true. And in terms of, their parts, so some of them had eyes and they would match with others with eyes, and some had sockets and they would sort of fit together in that sense. Whereas today, modern quantum mechanics sort of finds that there's like an electric energy holding them together, or magnetic forces. But still, he believed that these things had some reason to come together, and it wasn't like previous individuals who thought it was maybe some mystical logos or magical force, but there was actually something inherent about these atoms that holds them together. So one of the biggest difficulties that originally Parmenides proposed was the concept of the void. So he says that the Parmenidean one it's impossible for the Parmenidean one, which is perceived as a circle, to go into the void or to change, because the void, or nothing, does not exist. And Zeno sort of proves this through his paradoxes, right? Like, for example, the turtle and Achilles. The turtle can never approach Achilles, therefore change is impossible. But Democritus sort of shuts this down in a sort of blunt way, in just that he perceives the change, therefore it exists. And this is actually largely accepted and later proven more meritorious by Isaac Newton, and later by Einstein. But either way, he sort of believed that the void is there, and just because change can be proven. And Newton sort of proves this later through what's called absolute space. So in absolute space, there's like time and space are independent of perception. And Einstein later proves that too, in that relativity exists. So Newton says that time is separate from humans. So for example, Zeno's paradox, where Achilles will never catch a turtle because they both continuously move forward, but time is separate, an abstraction from humans or perception, so therefore the turtle can reach it, therefore the void can be crossed. So that's sort of just a more theoretical explanation of Democritus, and later Einstein sort of proves it through relativity. But either way, he sort of, or I don't think he fully explained it, but he gave people an explanation of, or something concrete to believe, where Parmenides made this void that was nothing. Democritus sort of found a way to cover it up, and basically that was that he observes change, therefore the void must exist. So in terms of epistemology, which is a big and once again a pretty heavy topic, and we've alluded to it a lot in a lot of these previous philosophers, he says that truth is sort of like think of it like an asymptote. It's almost impossible to hit, but you can approach it through intellect. So every fact is, or everything is, control, or our perception of it is controlled by biases and sensations. So very much like Protagoras, like there is no truth, only perception. He sort of thought that's true. Truth is blinded by perception, but through intellect one can approach the truth. So he believed that there's two types of knowing. There's legitimate and bastard. So bastard is sort of your perceptions, and legitimate is your truth. So the smarter you get, the closer you can get to the truth of any sort of object. So for example, he believed that nothing but atoms in chaos combine. So there's people perceive like an object, for example, and you could come up, it's object hot, object cold, but at the end of the day it's just atoms, and only through that intellect could you approach that, not through your perceptions. So that's sort of his approach there. In terms of mathematics, so I have this down here, he was the first to sort of prove this. He might not have been the first. A lot of these things actually probably came from Egypt, but he was maybe the first to bring it to Greece. But he perceived that either a cone or a pyramid, where the base equals the height, the volume of it is 1/3 of that of a cylinder or prism, respectively. So very much more interested in mathematics than Protagoras, and very much obviously I can't name many applications off the top of my head, but very useful in terms of any sort of engineering if you want to make a cylinder or cone or whatnot, or any sort of volume equations. It's a very simple equation, but very nice and very neat, and just to kind of show that a lot of these individuals were sort of polymaths, in that sort of going back to Protagoras' approach to learning everything is the best way to learn about something. So he was good at mathematics, he was good at physics, and as we will even see, he's sort of into ethics and politics too. And once again, learning is not like once again, going back to Protagoras, there's probably two philosophies. Either there's kind of the mastery approach, whereas if you're a doctor, you become the best doctor possible, and if your house breaks down, hire someone else to do that, specialization. Whereas Protagoras and Democritus, I think, would both agree that a holistic way of learning is the best. So even if you're a doctor, you should know how to fix your house in case things go down, or at least so you might know who can fix your house or who might be the best. So, and maybe by learning about building a house, you might become a better doctor as well. So once again, similar to Democritus, he was good at mathematics too. So in terms of his ethics and politics, so he was obviously, kind of ironically, very democratic. Ironic because his name is Democritus, and he supported the Athenian form of democracy. He thought poverty in democracy is better than prosperity under a tyrant. He has this quote: "The wise man belongs to all countries, for the home of a great soul is the whole world." So this is, I think, I was actually going to say this quote to the end because I think it's his most beautiful and kind of most representative of his life. So he saw the whole world as sort of one big community, one big community to learn from, or one great big group of people. And he didn't see, for example, there was no xenophobia or anything here. He thought that all people were sort of equal and all people lived in this one country. And that's probably why he was able to surpass so many people in terms of learning, was that he was able to go to Egypt, respect those Egyptians, and learn from them, whereas other people sort of stay home and don't learn anything. So he thought all people were equal, and all of them have something to add, and all people are sort of one community. And that's sort of also a democratic belief as well. And he thought making money is fine. Like, he had there's no shame in making money. Like, it's not like you make money and you become a tyrant. And this is kind of obviously he was very rich, so there's no shame in that, but he thought to wrongly make money is the worst of all things one can do. And he thought self-sufficiency is the most important thing. Obviously, extravagant wealth can be valuable, but he was never really into it. But he was already so rich anyways, he was able to be the host for Xerxes, so he probably didn't really need much more money, and he was more concerned with learning anyways. But he also thought, whereas many of the others, for example, the Pythagoreans, the Pythagorean cult, they would practice asceticism, so they would stick to strict diets and strict rituals. Democritus was sort of more lenient in that regard. He thought, it's okay to party, it's okay to feast, just in moderation, but it's an act of celebrating life. And that's why he's kind of considered, in my opinion, the archetype, or most people's opinion, of the laughing philosopher. So obviously the strict prudence to rules and to intellectual rigor, but also to have fun with it. And that's very different from a lot of the other philosophers we've seen, notably Heraclitus and the Pythagoreans. And also very contradictory to the Eastern philosophers we've seen, such as Mahavira and Buddha, who practice asceticism and restriction. Democritus is the archetype of the opposite, which is, just go study mathematics, but go have a nice meal with it or something. So, opposite end of the spectrum. Lastly, in terms of his beliefs in terms of the world, and kind of into his anthropology, and just to sum up sort of everything he believed. So, in terms of atomic theory, the universe started off with a bunch of atoms sort of floating around, and then in a form of chaos, and they started to combine, probably through the nature of the atoms. And he believed there are many worlds, some with moons, some with stars, and sometimes these crashed together and destroyed each other. So probably very similar to probably how I perceive the world too, like our solar system is a type of atom, or some sort of body, part of a greater mass. But either way, that's sort of how he saw the beginning of the universe. Not very much different from what we believe today. And so much time has gone by. We built the atomic bomb, but not much has changed in terms of his atomic theory and his theory of the universe. Maybe we've gotten more precise with it. And then, in terms of the development of people, so first humans were he believed were savages, just hunter-gatherers. They did not have language or anything. So he sort of saw, whereas some previous philosophers thought that humans create and destroy but never really change too much. Humans have sort of been constant throughout all of history. He saw that there was sort of a constant upward trend of humanity, and once again a positive outlook to the world, and once again sort of indicative of his title, The Laughing Philosopher, and his positivity, and one of the reasons he's super important. So yeah, just before going to the comparison, I like to talk about the artists if they're important, and once again these two were not very artful leaders of thought, so I thought every day it's nice to have a little bit of art, so I'll talk about it. So this is a photo by Bragan, and this is a photo by Rembrandt. So I'm a pretty big fan of Rembrandt. He's got some great paintings, such as I love the Night's Watch, but most importantly I think I like his vulgarism. So it's not necessarily the best to look at, but previously there had been what's called classical art, where it's about all kinds of heroes and glory, and everyone is happy, and then everyone is beautiful, everyone's got six-pack, huge biceps, and everything's great. But Rembrandt was a vulgarist, or sort of a realist. He would draw people as they, back in the day in Amsterdam, people were not pretty. They had warts, they had horrible skin, poor hygiene. Even the wealthy would wear these things around their head. You might have seen them, those big white things, because other people stunk or their own body stunk so much, because they obviously didn't have toilet paper or anything, so they just put cologne so they don't. Imagine your own body smells so much that you can't smell. It's one thing if someone else smells, but Rembrandt really did that, and it's not the best. It's not the greatest to look at. You don't want to. It's great to look at a great glorious picture, but looking at an ugly image. Once again, sorry, these are both Democritus paintings of Democritus, but it's not a great image of him. It's not overly glorifying. It makes him sort of ugly. And most notably, Rembrandt has self-portraits, and he draws himself hideous. And I think the main takeaway here, and from my perception of art, is that art is not about finding just something that's visually stunning or visually pleasing. Same thing with music. You don't want to just have a constant ear orgasm. That's sort of like cheating. It's about or the point of literature and the point of art is to see other people, or to realize that other people exist and there is a humanity. That's why I think, for example, Shakespeare is so important, or any sort of literature. It's that when you read that literature, you realize other people exist, and you're not alone in this world. And most importantly, other people struggle. So you're having a bad day, you open the book, it's like, oh, wow, life for Romeo and Juliet, it's pretty horrible. So maybe my life's not so bad. And that's why I think, although moving to something like Rembrandt, I wouldn't really want to have too many Rembrandt pictures in my house, because, why do I want to have a bunch of hideous-looking people looking around? I'd rather have glorious titans and warriors. But it's an important aspect of the humanities, and I think very much, just as much art, if not more so artistic. So, yeah, sorry for that little divergence. So, in terms of the comparison, in terms of differences, obviously, as noted before, Protagoras was not very much into the mathematics. Despite being a student of Democritus, he thought that all of the mathematic concepts didn't even actually exist in real life, and real life was all about man's perception of the world. And the mathematics was sort of like an art, too abstract, but it didn't really have much real-world applications. Whereas Democritus thought very much the different. For example, well, definitely in terms of this cylinder and cone mathematics, that obviously has real-world applications. But something like atomic theory at the time probably didn't have a lot of. It didn't have any application. What are they going to do? There's a bunch of tiny atoms in here. How can we use it? There's no real way, so Protagoras would have probably criticized him on that. But once again, Democritus sort of had an eager he probably adhered to Protagoras' belief even more so than Protagoras. So in that Protagoras believed in holistically educating one on everything, he sort of neglected the mathematics, whereas Democritus focused on every single concept of learning, and for that reason he excelled in mathematics. So sort of hypocritical on Protagoras' part for not respecting the mathematics, and pat on the back for Democritus for doing so. In terms of similarities, they're both from the same town in Thrace, supposedly, and they both had the similar teachers, Anaxagoras. In terms of another difference in terms of Athens, so Protagoras was ultimately sent out of Athens for being an atheist, and similarly Democritus, even though his ideas were very in line with the beliefs of Athenians, he was also not really loved in Athens as well. But in terms of the difference here is, I think Democritus was generally more loved than Protagoras. Protagoras ultimately had his books burned and whatnot, whereas Democritus has the great title of the laughing philosopher, so he's considered a generally positive figure throughout both his contemporaries and throughout the future. Lastly, in regards to their relationship to other philosophers, Plato was not very fond of Protagoras' beliefs regarding the perception being everything. He thought there were actually objective beliefs, but I think Plato would have agreed mostly with all that Democritus said, especially considering covering that void that Parmenides created with the void, or the lack of void rather. So yeah, that's Protagoras and Democritus. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch some of the latter newer ones that will be coming, and perhaps some of the previous ones. Thanks so much. Bye.